Thank you. Thank you very much. I apologize. I will read quite a bit just to keep me on track so that I don't go wandering off into, too much horsey land on everybody. But thank you. So first of all, I want to say thank you to everyone for welcoming me here today. What I have to present to you is material that's a little bit peripheral to my official research, which is on 19th century domestic space in colonial Canada. But as my academic interest in sort of humans and animals has sort of continued to grow, I find that horses continue to creep into my writing and my research. So while reading through several Victorian women's travel diaries that describe sort of official state visits as well as their stories of settler experiences, I noticed a pattern emerge that identified sort of key activities highlighting the exotic in the Canadian wilderness experience. And you're all thinking, exotic, what is exotic about Canada? Well, for someone from England in the 19th century, forests are exotic. Sleigh rides are exotic. And so perhaps I think the most iconic, and for me this talk, is their description of sleigh rides. I think the shock of sort of winter severity also for 19th century settlers was a shock in and of itself. And so sleigh rides sort of counter the melancholy that winter tends to bring. Let's see what, oh, no, that's backwards. So in her description of life in the 19th century Canadian backwoods, Catherine Parr Trail describes the exhilaration and velocity of her first sleigh ride as breathtaking, as she extols the virtues of Canadian winter to her readers, who were the future emigrants to Canada. Her sister, Susanna Moody, also a writer, on the other hand, chose to emphasize the less exhilarating and more uncomfortable aspects of this as a method of transportation. She complains about the hard edges and the bumps and stumbles along the way. For Moody, life in the bush was uncomfortable, unyielding, and dangerously hard work. The presentation that follows examines the promotional aspects of the sleigh ride as a leisure activity that involved the combination of both horses and pleasure as an escape from the hard work faced by 19th century British settlers. So I will introduce you to several Victorian travel diarists in conjunction with both sort of official and amateur visual representations of sleigh adventures. And what I argue is that by promoting the leisure activity of the horse-drawn sleigh ride, both writers and artists served the British imperial agenda, initially by reinforcing British superiority and military order through the spectacle of communal sleigh rides, as well as encouraging the sagacious qualities of pluck and patience that successful settlers required. In tandem with this was an undercurrent that considered the potential that existing colonial equine resources held for exploitation. And I should tell you there that I am an owner of a Canadian horse, so this was really kind of interesting to me. Yes, Canadians are heritage. It's a heritage breed. Well, we can talk about that after the talk, and I will talk your ear off. As a leisure activity, the sleigh ride imagined the benefits of a healthy outdoor lifestyle that emigration to North America promised, while descriptions of the horses that drew the sleighs reinforced imperial agendas that sought to both promote rugged and sturdy emigrant stock and denigrate the existing colonial population, but also sort of this horse stock. So by focusing specifically on description of sleigh rides and the description of the Canadian horses, both explicit in the diaries and implicit in the paintings, this interdisciplinary talk will highlight sort of these tensions that existed both between the existing humans and non-human animals. The image on this particular slide I want to sort of mention was actually by a lady called Millicent Mary Chaplin, who was the spouse of one of these military officers. So several of her sketches show up in this presentation. So along with writing, and along with the sort of official military artists sort of sketching these, their wives were involved in sketch clubs and did the same thing. So I find it very interesting that the women themselves are engaged in this practice. This is from about 1842. So first, a little historical context. Most of the images that I'm going to show you sort of show up after the end of the War of 1812, and sort of through the 1830s and 40s, which is when British North America was sort of in a phase of rebellion. Canada was trying to become its own country. So there was a reasonably strong military presence in Upper and Lower Canada. These are sort of upper, middle, and upper class soldiers, trained professionals, surveyors, engineers, so they do have an interest in documenting what they're doing. So to a degree, it's a documentation, but it's also an interpretation. So many of the images come from published collections of military artists, and this was an effort. This effort was actually sustained by the British Army, who bought a printing press specifically to print and circulate these amateur images. So there was a reason behind them. They don't just sort of exist in archives. They're out there in circulation. The British government also was actively encouraging immigration, but since Canada was not yet a country, it lacked any sort of clear national identity. And there was an active sort of undercurrent in all of these diaries sort of describing the nation and what it could be. So you wonder how we sort of got to our ideas. It kind of starts here. Starts earlier, but arguably from a recorded standpoint to say this is what we're fighting against now, what we're rubbing our shoulders against is what sort of starts here. Quick search of the Library and Archives Canada, which is where a lot of these images reside, sort of shows that the bulk of them kind of come between the years 1830 and 1850, which really does coincide with this military occupation. They dwindle substantially in the 1860s and then increase again later, but by then they're all photographs. Everybody's taking pictures of themselves, their horses, and their sleighs. So in many ways, life on the frontier provided women also with an opportunity to sort of self-reinvent, but only within certain limitations. The risk for women who lived unconventional lives in the frontier would have included marginalization, ostracism or denigration, which left sort of their characters nationally suspect. So while these publications themselves were rather provocative, they really don't challenge the status quo, right? They're reinforcing it. And then, so this is just a little, this was a print, but it is a quick pencil sketch. Actually, I think I've gone one slide too far. Aha, I'm right where I need to be now. Sorry, I shouldn't have advanced. So these are the sleighs of Major Wingfield of the 32nd Regiment and Captain McKinnon. It is a print, although it initially started as a sketch, but once again, an amateur sketch that's sort of asserting this wonderful adventure. The next few slides I'm going to take you through are images that are created by military artists first. And many of the activities captured by these artists were the regular meetings of tandem clubs or sleigh clubs. These are social events that were arranged to keep the garrison soldiers active and entertained through the long winter months. They also formed sketching clubs. But what does tandem mean? Tandem means that the sleighs go one after the other. It's not a race, although they go really fast. And they're not sort of going side by side. Tandem means to go one behind the other. And frequently, you'll see the horses are hitched in tandem, which is actually a really difficult way to drive horses. It's easier to drive them side by side. Many of the images were watercolor or pencil sketches that could be quickly created, easily transported, carefully preserved, and generally inexpensive. The artist training of most military men, particularly the British Armed Forces, focused on the use of watercolors and paper as a quick and inexpensive medium of expression. But because loose paper is difficult to transport and somewhat expensive, they tended to have small sketchbooks. So none of these images are really much bigger than about 8 by 10. Perhaps most significantly, we might look to Clay McShane and Jill Tarr, who identify elite carriage driving, and this is something that was going on in Europe and in places like Central Park, as a spectacle sport in their collaboration, of course, in the city. In other words, we can read the sleigh ride process as a display of elite status performed by the wealthy in which to admire one another, and to be admired by everybody else, right? So indeed, a reporter for the 19th century periodical Outing describes the spectacle of carriage driving in Central Park as a display of all that is loveliest in womanhood, all that men most envy in their fellow man, and all that is best in horse flesh. So by reading the sleigh clubs in colonial Canada in this manner, I was led to sort of Laurent Turcotte, who also argues this sentiment in his study of the promenade. And this is what I mean by the promenade. You see them in tandem, one after the other, doing a big sort of, they generally had a loop that they did in various cities. They would have been in garrison cities, Toronto, Montreal, Quebec, St. John, Fredericton, Halifax, St. John's, to name a few. Niagara Falls. So he argues, however, that the transfer of the promenade to Canada required adapting to our harsher climates and social norms which produced this winter promenade. So some of the earliest Canadian artistic renditions of non-military sleigh clubs can demonstrate these key features of the promenade: to see and to be seen. So this one is really not, I will get into some where you can see the sleighs a little bit more, and we'll discuss some material things. But so this is Quebec. Here we have Halifax, Dalhousie Square. And as we can see here, everyone is clearly out to be seen, right? We see beautifully sort of drawn horses, and when you're looking at horses in drawings, pay attention to the curve of the neck, arched necks, and graceful legs, and this sort of active pace. This is a connotation. This is expensive horse flesh. This is something desirable. These are the best horses. There's also some other key features of the sleigh ride that you're going to see from a material perspective. Bearskin rugs. I don't want to press anything to try to get a pointer. Bearskin rugs.
Just the
bells,
orange button.
The orange buttons.
And when you take your finger off it, the pointer goes away.
I don't want to advance it, which is what I will do.
Yeah.
Bearskin rugs. There are usually bells somewhere on the sleighs, feathers in the horse's hair, or on their manes, and then even just beautiful big whips, which really they don't need. It's the idea that you crack the whip, the horse goes. The horse is going to go anyway. They're mostly for show. So think about sort of the spectacle is happening. Everybody's gathering. We have little boys playing in the front. There's almost always a little boy playing in the front right corner. I don't know why. And there's almost always a dog chasing the horses, having a good time. So even the dogs are in on it. This one here is Meeting of the Sleigh Club in the Barracks of St. John. So now we're in New Brunswick. Which this particular watercolor is by one of these military artists, and we're going to see him a couple times, Sir Richard George Augustus Lavinge. We don't need to have the whole name, don't worry. But in this image, we see sort of the barracks in the background holding a very dominant position, right? This is very much a military photo. Like the barracks are huge, they're dominating this image. The horses, once again, are examples of fine British thoroughbreds. They all have arched necks. A lot of them have bobbed tails, potentially docked tails. We still see our bearskin rugs, not as clearly, and everybody is out to see. These groups of people in the front here. Actually, it's better if I just go like this because people on screen can't see. They're there to watch. So are these guys are getting ready to ride, and then the ladies are ready to be passengers. So they're finely decorated sleighs, carefully turned out regimental officers, and you see them in the middle there. And the ladies provide the final accessory as they entertain the officers in preparation for their outing. The Toronto Tandem Club immortalized these women, as well as themselves and their horses, in verse. However, that was typically done by nickname. And we'll hear a little bit about them later on in the presentation. There was also sort of a lot of tongue-in-cheek humor that went along with these outings. And in 1836, the Montreal Morning Courier had a little back and forth through their social pages by a Lizzie Gadabout, who complained that the soldiers didn't stop to, when she was waving her handkerchief, didn't stop to pick her up to take her for a ride. And the soldiers write her back and say, well, really, we don't have time for Lizzie Gadabouts. So there's a lot to be said about women's behavior and manners in that whole little exchange as well. So what kind of ladies were actually chasing the soldiers, right? And this is the interesting one, in her recent paper, Colonial Artists and Dispossession of the Maliseet in New Brunswick, Andrea Baer-Nicholas argues that while these early colonial artists did at least provide documentation, and here's just discussing sort of Maliseet presence in the province, they do document it. The artwork tended to present them as relatively well off and as picturesque curiosities. So despite what other historic sources like Petition and other records tell us, if we looked at only these, and if you're in Britain and you're only seeing images like this, you think that Indigenous peoples in Canada are having a great time. And this, here once again, this group here, right dead center, is a group of Maliseets out for the adventure, out for the outing, there to see. And this is, so ultimately she argues these are, I think I'm repeating myself, but I'm going to because I lost my spot. I apologize. Ultimately, she argues that these artistic representations of reality may have contributed not only to the ongoing dispossession and displacement, but also the near extinction of the Maliseet population in New Brunswick by the mid-1800s. It's an interesting paper. There's some interesting things there. But what I mentioned to you, why I mentioned this to you now, is look for Indigenous peoples in the next few slides. Where do you see them? How do they look to you? If you have any knowledge of Canadian history, was this what you would expect? Oh, and this is also another angle of St. John, New Brunswick, and the Sleighs Park. So that's the barracks again, and then the outing from a different angle. A similar argument might be made regarding local colonists, including Canadians, Acadians, or habitants. In this example by Arthur James Herbert, another military artist, which is this is a watercolor. He sort of positions these sort of the colonists, and I'm going to assume that this is French. There is something to be said iconically about the red sash when you see them in paintings. He's there happily waving on to the officer and these other and his sort of in relation to these two British officers sliding by. So the two Sleighs, even though there's two Sleighs in this image and we have our little dog running, there is definitely a disparity in status here, and there is a message in this that we have a predominantly large and very elegant horses in our central image, whereas we have a dowdy little Canadian pony on a very rudimentary wooden sleigh in the corner. Now, shifting gears a little bit. Ooh, I lost a page here. How did I lose a page? There we go. One of the key highlights of any winter outing found in almost every diarist account is Montmorency Falls in Quebec. The scenic display of the hydraulic power still draws tourists today, we could say, especially in winter when these fantastic ice cones, these big mounds form at the base of the falls. So in this image called The Ice Cone by Robert Cloud Todd, and I'm going to show you two more by him, this sort of demonstrates the exotic qualities that Canada offered to its emigrants. We have the ice cone to see. We have lots of ladies in their finery. beautiful one here in the middle. And yet they're there to be seen. They're not actually actively doing something. She's right in the middle. They want you to look at her. We see everything that men envy, the beautiful sleighs. Look at the shape of some of these. These would have been incredibly expensive. Our bearskin rug, which actually looks like it has a lion's face on it, right here, corner. The best of British thoroughbred horseflesh. Not as elegant. This is just the style of this particular painter. Grays, bays, chestnuts, all fine boned, well turned out, drawing in tandem, which sort of permits the viewer the opportunity to appreciate each horse separately, rather than emphasize their role as a team. Right? One might even argue that the tandem sleigh itself emphasize the hierarchy of horses as well as humans, as you have a leader and a wheeler, and they each will have a separate role. So in this particular slide, we don't see any Indigenous people. We see little boys playing in the corner with their little wooden sled. But same artist, same place, different painting. We do start to see them looking quite happy, and these look more like automatons than not, but they're still quite happy, quite pleasant. They're there watching. Our ladies are in the middle, and our horses are definitely there to be seen. And then finally, we do have Indigenous people here in the corner looking quite comfortable. And not quite so many horses, though, in this one. But there's still this idea of this was a place to be seen. They're not actively taking part in this promenade. They are on the outside of it. Okay, now shifting gears a little. Here we go. This image is actually from the Diary of Elizabeth Simcoe from 1792, and it demonstrates the difference between the officer's carriole and the regular farm sleigh. You thought I wasn't going to talk about the sleighs at all. Simcoe describes Quebec as a gay place in winter full of balls and outings, its dry, cold air so invigorating that it prevents the ill health I should acquire without so much sitting up, in other words, being out late. She does describe her first experience in the carriole as unpleasant. The snow was not deep enough to enable the carriole to run smoothly, so that I was terribly shaken, she says, and I was quite seasick in the carriage. Ultimately, she preferred the open carriole set on lower runners to the more elegantly appointed and more treacherous officer's carriole. So I'm going to take a minute to talk to you about what that means. So the carriole is essentially what they initially called the sleighs. It's a French word. And the officers' carrioles were typically up higher on wooden runners that were covered in iron. They had a higher center of gravity. They're elegant, they're pretty, they're not comfortable. They don't steer very well. You need to make really wide turns. If you're familiar with driving, these smaller ones, they handle a little bit more like a go-kart. This one a little bit more like a land yacht or a bus. So these older, lower the ground, more conventional models, they were more comfortable, they were faster, they were cheaper, and they were easier. So she prefers this ride. Lady Durham, another one of these diarists, echoes a sentiment in her journal from 1838, as the weather conditions required her family to abandon their English chariot in favor of a Canadian one, which, she says, were uncouth-looking vehicles, but more calculated for the roads we were traveling. And later she mentions the Canadian ponies and carriages that they had purchased as she takes visitors to see the views of Quebec and Montmorency. She was very proud of her Canadian ponies and her little cart, and really enjoyed taking people on visits. This one I have in here just to sort of point out an officer's carriole a little bit better for you, because Elizabeth Simcoe's description was a little crude, but you can see you're up quite high on very thin rudders, they're really not maneuverable. They do eventually design sleighs that have a split rudder, so that the first portion steers with the horse, and the latter half stays behind, but not at this stage in the game. So in the newly opened territory in Upper Canada near Peterborough, Catherine Parr Trail describes, and I mentioned this at the beginning, the exhilaration for first sleigh ride as breathtaking as she felt herself impelled forward with a velocity that nearly took away my breath and left her in a glow from head to foot. So there's this romanticizing that goes on with sleigh rides. She further describes it as certainly a very agreeable mode of traveling. The more snow, the better. The more snow, the better sleighing season is considered, and the harder it becomes, the easier the motion of the vehicle. So you want hard packed snow, you don't want loose snow, you don't want thick snow. She talks about the merry jingle of the sleigh bells as being a key part of the sleigh ride. And the contraptions that served as sleighs suggest that sleigh riding was also a great social leveler. We saw everybody out on promenade, but she argues, okay, I'm going to argue that maybe it is. So she says, as soon as sufficient quantity of snow had fallen, all the vehicles of every description from stagecoach to wheelbarrow are supplied with wooden runners shod with iron in the manner of skates. The usual equipages for traveling are the double sleighs, the light wagon, and cutter. And she goes on to describe how many horses. And some are much more elegant looking than others. I want to take you to the next slide, but before I do that, this is another image by Millicent Mary Chaplin, our military wife, who is recording her sketches, and this is her carryall. So right around the same time that Catherine Parr Trail is writing. They're in different places, but Trail doesn't really provide us with any good images of sleighs. No, okay, no, I don't want to go there yet. So these descriptions emphasize the pleasure found in leisure activities, the health benefits of an active life in the Canadian outdoors, and the roles that sleighs had as active social levelers. But before we take this notion of social leveling too far, it's important to note that Moody, her Trail's sister, does not recommend emigration to just anyone. And I did say sort of talk a little bit about the emigrant stock. Indeed, her memoir emphasizes that there's another class of persons most unsuited to the woods, the wives and families of those who have once been opulent tradesmen, accustomed to the daily enjoyment of every luxury that money could cure or fashion invent, whose idea of happiness are connected to the rounds of amusement company and the novelties of dress and pleasure that the gay world can offer. So in other words, if you are one of these gadabouts or townies, as we saw, maybe you want to stay in England, don't come here. It's too hard a life. And this is Millicent Chapman's actual sleigh. This is what she says was her sleigh. So I would argue that she actually preferred that old-fashioned carryall style that Elizabeth Simcoe did, something close to the ground. Although she does have means, because those are very crude images of bearskin rugs. It is we're not going to talk about that one. I've already talked about the horses. You say I talked about the horses before, and then I put my horse talking here. Ask a question.
That horse.
This horse here. Okay. Well, what I just. All right, I'll tell you what I was going to say. I know. Well, okay. So Moody says about the Canadian horse, or Trail says, sorry, about the Canadian horse. It's the sagacity of the horses in this country that is truly admirable. Their patience in surmounting the different difficulties they have to encounter in avoiding falls is really what renders them useful. They have very sturdy limbs, short necks, and small ears. Now, what I see here is that, remember a few slides back, or even there, I mean, this is Millicent Mary Chaplin sort of looking at promenade horses. They look quite nice. But if we look at just average horses, a lot of the times your average stock does not look like those beautiful horses that are being driven by the officers. So there is a hierarchy. It does look a little bit like a mule. It's not, but that's kind of on purpose. And the same with this one. So we see once again Canadian horse, wooden sleigh, and habitat. So this is where I wanted to go. If we consider the harsh realities of the Canadian winter, we might think about sort of the more practical or environmental aspects of social leveling. And so from a purely practical standpoint, the frozen rivers and lakes and ground provided a solid work surface for farmers and loggers who needed to clear forests for future colonial farmland and mill logs for lumber to build houses. It was actually easier to get around by frozen river than it was to drive over land. So winter, once the rivers froze, actually provided an incredible sort of social opportunity for colonists that they couldn't have other times of year. So travel was really difficult. The rivers, once they freeze, make travel, they become sort of the arteries and the highways, especially here in New Brunswick. This is sort of one of the places where these rivers are critical. But here we also have an example of this social leveling. Everybody can get involved in sleigh riding, just not in the big fancy promenades. So we've got a little boy here with his dog. And Habitant over here, his horse is carrying a barrel of water so that all the other horses have something to drink. Partly. We do have our officers in their tandem sleigh looking very elegant. And this one is one horse sleigh. We have an ox, and I think he's got a sleigh full of logs, and I'm not entirely sure what this poor sad horse in the bottom left corner is carrying in that round hut. It could actually be an ice hut. It did have a lot of ice to say. It looks like an ice hut to me. So, sorry, to go back to that one, what I was saying there, ultimately, anybody who had access to a horse and a wagon or a flat box could get out there and use it as a sleigh. So now we'll go back to Susanna Moody. I talk about her a lot, I'm sorry. Not sorry. While Susanna Moody's experience as a settler in Eastern Ontario's backwoods echo this argument when she refers to snow as the great leveler that makes all rough places smooth, and it does ensure swift transport. It was not enough to ensure the survival of all English refinements. While transporting all of her worldly goods through the Canadian woods in winter, Moody records her adventures at a fallen tree in the path of the sleigh. They had to make the horses jump over. The first driver gets across and says to the second driver, "Just do what I did." And he tries, and of course, the sleigh tips over, and she says, "I cannot tell. The sleigh, as it hung poised on top of the log, was overturned with a loud crash, and all my household goods and chattels were scattered over the road. Alas for my crockery and stone china, barely one article remained unbroken." So she loses, all of her cups, saucers, pans, pots, anything that typically English women, especially at this time, as they're really increasingly interested in, and this is a consumer sort of practice, they're purchasing their china sets, and off she goes into the woods with her china set, and she loses it. That story is actually quite common. The dangers of sleigh riding, especially for those with adventurous attitude, sometimes outweigh their practical restraint, is evident in the frequency of accidents. So the Tandem Club of Toronto glorified several of these accidents in verse. Yes, they glorified the women, they also glorified the accidents. It was sort of a social thing. They get together at the end of the evening, and one of them would have been assigned the job to write a poem about last month's adventure, and they would have to recite this, and all these poems are published, and they're quite fun. So they describe horses that slip on the ice hidden under fresh snow, horses who refuse to turn either because of their excitement or due to that lack of maneuverability that I mentioned. Other horses bolt and run away with their passengers, and finally, and here I will read you a brief passage, and I apologize for my ability to recite poetry. Poor Colonel Wells's sleigh was there, just in the road it stood. And so he must their diversion share or cut in haste his wood. In other words, he's going to have to chop his sleigh in half. Doesn't get it. The colonel stands, and into he the furious horses dash. Right seldom do spectators see so elegant a smash. And it sounds silly to us, but you know, if you think about it, it kind of sounds like a Formula One announcer talking about these spectacular crashes as instead of, you know, Formula One cars racing around a track, we have these horses and sleighs. So there's this element of, ooh, this spectacle. Look at all these great things. Yes, we have horse flesh and sleighs we can admire, but we can also sort of immortalize these spectacular crashes. It also reaffirms the sleigh ride clubs operated as spectacle sports, not simply upper class diversions. So this tongue-in-cheek verse, sort of, as I said, could be read like a Formula One announcer. That I did put that in there. It's like, so yes, and this is very much officer sleighs being stumbled here. Perhaps most bone-chilling is Emily Elizabeth Bevan's description of an overly confident sleigh driver in her memoir, Life in the Backwoods of New Brunswick. She reminds her readers that traveling on the ice is not altogether free of danger. As she recounts, one of the parties who accompanied us wished to reach the shore. There was a path, which, though rather longer, would have led them safely to it, but he was determined to strike across the unmarked ice. The gallant steed bounded forward, the golden light beaming in the sky, and we paused to watch his progress. As a fearful crashing was heard, and then a snap and a crack, the sleigh, the horse, and the rider vanished from our sight. So sometimes, yes, they did fall through the ice. It was really rather tragic. So whether sporting misadventure or human blunder, the perils of the Canadian winter required colonial pluck and determination, and a little bit of common sense, I would say, in order to survive. So I want to return to our earlier military documentary artist, Lavinge, the one who painted the sleigh clubs in St. John, as he describes both painting a new sleigh and purchasing a new horse in New Brunswick. And it also brings us back to the materiality of the sleigh to some small degree. He says, I found that a white background, and although I have no proof that this is this actual sleigh that he's describing, it really, if I read this and you look at this, you can almost follow along. I found that a white background picked out with bright vermilion, like red, and a bear and buffalo skins. I see bear and buffalo skins there. With a liberal quantity of deep scarlet curtain fringe. I see the curtain fringe on his bear skins. Looked extremely light and gay on the snow, and the white here, far from being relieved by the vermilion, had no dirty appearance when it contrasted with the snow. So I find it really fascinating that we actually have this description of, you know, he's actually done the painting, he's decided what's on there, but we also get a description of the various accoutrements for sleigh riding. We get the bear skins, we get the fringes, we get the little insignias. We have our beautiful, elegant horses done in tandem so that we can see them each. We see the sleigh bells, the harnesses. That's a whole other talk. And so, while I don't have proof, I think there's a lot there. For those of you with mild interests in sleighs at all as material items, I would highly recommend visiting the Campbell Carriage Factory here in Sackville, just up the road. They do have a few, and they even have a few bear skins there that are really quite fascinating. He also, nope, let me see here. He also adds the following descriptions of Canadian horses. He says, the horses bred in this province are compact little animals and trot at a tremendous pace, which is true. They're really good trotters, particularly upon glare ice. They're docile, really, he says, from being brought up as part of the family, and they are attached to their people. He says, so attached are the blue nosers to them that a man, hearing I possessed a gray horse, come on, the famous trotter, which he had bred, came a long distance to see him. 2 years had elapsed since he had sold him, but no sooner had he entered the stables and spoken to him than the horse reared up on his hind legs and showed every symptom of recognition and delight. Okay, so Phoenix, I hadn't seen for 4 years before he came back to me, and the second he got off the trailer, he doesn't rear because he has bad legs. The second he got off the trailer, it was like, Mom, and lots of calling. So they do recognize, they do. And I thought that was really sweet. So he makes other comparisons to Canadian horses and colonists. And he finds a lot to admire, but I won't go into that too much. So I'm not suggesting that the horses here are material, but that I will go into this. What he does say is that the sort of colonial method of cooling their horses down is not like the English. They don't use big bits. They don't have a lot of extra tack. They don't use whips, and they don't bother to sort of put blankets on their horses to cool them down at the end. So this reluctance of the Acadians in this case to engage with what the English felt were necessary materials for driving, bearing rein, snaffle bits, blankets, and stables, sort of suggests that he's also making a comment on the kind of people that are going to be required to and suited to this country. So ultimately, despite his distinguished position as an army lieutenant, Lavinge admired the customs of the colony, and in his reports back to England, he encourages an appreciation for the resourcefulness, hard work, and resilience to the cold, both found in the horses and the residents of the colony. Most notably, I find personally that the recognition of this Canadian-bred horse demonstrated towards his former owner reflects that final trait desirable in immigrants, the recognition of home. So this notion of coming home, or recognizing home, as well as the appeal of the sleigh bell, sort of brings me back to Susanna Moodie and the poem that inspired the title of my presentation. And she's overly romantic and really sort of pedantic in this, as anyone would expect an amateur sort of middle-aged woman to be.
Hey.
Sorry, I'm going to back up. In the 19th century. Not today. I thought that was implicit. I apologize. Oh boy. So she's writing about her husband coming home and hearing the sleigh bells, and quite excited to know that the bounding steeds bring near the loved one to our bosoms dear. This is what I mean by this overly heavy-handed romantic. 'Tis he, and blithely the gay bells sound as his sleigh glides over frozen ground. And so she gets all excited because he's coming home. So this notion of returning home opens up a new way to think about sort of women's experiences in colonial Canada as they connect with both the adventurous and rather masculine outdoors with sort of more female depiction of domestic stability. Susanna at home by the fire, listening attentively to the sound of the bells that signal her husband's return. This all is quite cozy and romantic until you remember that she's living in the remote wilderness of newly acquired territory outside Peterborough. So this penultimate image here depicts the sleigh ride in this final manner. And while it's not clear whether the sleigh is leaving or returning home, it does appear to be returning home to me, it's a relationship between the two that I find most interesting. This watercolor actually sort of recently went through some research and has now been correctly attributed to a woman, Caroline Louisa Daly, who was a daughter of the Lieutenant Governor of PEI in the 1830s. And while the domestic structure in this particular slide is obviously rather imposing, not like my house, it does suggest that returning to the comforts of home remained a significant feature of the sleigh ride, and by comparison, the imperial exercise. So posting to the colonies, and as I said, these were typically military artists, might be adventurous and profitable. The promise of home, and in this image, remains sort of foremost in the minds of colonial officials. In the same vein, encouraging adventurous and resourceful colonists who remain loyal to home became instrumental to the colonial exercise. Excuse me. And in conclusion, the 19th century settler experience encouraged the joys of the sleigh driving as a key feature of Canadian leisure activities. It was, in essence, pleasure riding at its most communal and functioned as an expression of Canadian spirit despite the weather. As an indicator of social class, it reinforced the cultural power of the horse through organized activities of the early sleigh clubs and their importation of the spectacle of the promenade, emphasizing the fine horses as but it was also a social leveler that ensured that outdoor activity promoted the health and well-being of colonists. But on the level of lived experiences, it promoted the sagacity necessary for both horse and settler to survive in the wilderness and know their way back home. Questions?
Thank you so much, Trudy. Well, I totally.
If you want to see another picture, just tell me. I'll zoom back if you have questions.
Can I ask? I don't want this to all be about horses, but just a bit about horses. I noticed that they all have they're really, high set neck, like harness horses, even the ones that you were calling thoroughbreds. So do you know that they imported thoroughbreds from England?
They import some.
Yeah,
they definitely do. And there are places that I could do some more digging and research. I would love to do that after. But yeah,
I was reading through.
Uniacke actually was a horse breeder and importer. Richard Uniacke
in Nova Scotia. Yeah. I was reading through. I can't remember. I was looking for material on the Indian school in Sussex, New Brunswick, and so was going through sort of local publications, and just found this wealth of information about the encouragement of the provincial government, to a farmer in the Sussex area to bring in, a quality stallion to improve the quality of horses.
That is all part of it too. So while they're trying to improve the immigrant stock, they're trying to improve the horse stock. Yeah. And that's sort of the underlying undercurrent here. I couldn't,
Yeah. I thought your comment at the end about, this idea of returning home after the, bracing cold, and, your suggestion that this, is a metaphor sort of for the colonial experience. So we are now living in the bracing cold of North America, but, we'll soon return home. I'm going to take that home with me and think about it a lot. Okay. It's just a really neat notion. Thank you.
I had a question. It's a bit strange. So if I think about sculpture from the 1900s in the colonial environment, there's a lot of male animals, and they're clearly male animals because their genitalia is often included as part of the sculpture. And I noticed that despite vocalizing the gender of some of the horses, none of them seem to be male horses in these images. And I was wondering if you've noticed that pattern in illustration of the period, the exclusion of male gender characteristics.
I think it would just depend on okay, first of all, a lot of these, this one, these are drawn by ladies. Those are actually supposed to be horses. It's just not, she's just not a good artist. Okay, 1792, right? She can't draw, they look like cows. But a lot of these, they're female artists, and that wouldn't be appropriate. So first of all, it would not be appropriate for a woman to paint genitalia on a horse in any way. So whether they're stallions or not something that a lady is going to actually put on a horse. But so the artist that did these three images of Montmorency was actually quite a good artist and was commissioned to do paintings of horses and particularly stallions. And yes, in those other paintings that are not sleigh rides, that are just the horses, yes, you do see. You almost rarely see images of mares. it is a thing that if you're going to actually advertise a horse, you're going to advertise the stallion.
Yeah.
So for a long time, it was that the stallion was what was going to improve your stock. Don't understand why, because your mare brings the other 50% of the DNA to the pack, to the deal. But
Patriarchy for you.
I know
One stallion can improve the
Yeah.
offspring
of several,
a
which is true.
county of mares.
This is very true.
And one mare.
And they literally would. They would literally they'd advertise in the newspapers that the stallion is coming, and they would take the stallion from farm to farm to farm and impregnate as many as they could and then move on to the next county. Yeah. So did that answer your question?
Yeah,
It kind of does.
it's a weird observation.
Yeah, I think
I am just shocked. Like, that totally didn't occur to me as we were looking at all of, this lovely horse flesh. It's really weird.
the other thing, we just all of a sudden lost all the people. The other thing is that I would almost argue that if it's for public consumption, you don't want them either. This is uptight British Victorian society. If anything was going to be, because a lot of these prints were published, you're not going to necessarily show that.
But it's not that
I know.
glaring and visible.
I know.
We're not talking about like a stallion in a state of excitement.
No.
We're talking about like just a very.
I know. But it is interesting.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Just one more. I'm just wondering about including images in your research, if you could comment on that, because a lot of the audience is students who are working themselves with images, and how that kind of influences your own research, just being able to include those visual sources in it.
I'm not exactly sure how to answer that, but because I work on material that is so far in the past, the images give me a way to, for me personally, it's a way to actually get closer to the material. Sometimes it helps me to sort of understand what it is that I'm reading in a way that sometimes the words just don't kind of bring something alive. Other times it simply reinforces what I'm reading. And I'm not sure whether that's really answering your question.
Yeah, visualizing the past in a sense.
But yeah.
Allow that, and they do it better, I guess, than words. Are you working primarily with archival images, or are they digital images, or what sorts of images do you include? And you have included a number of really eye-catching ones in this presentation.
And these ones are all actually available in the public domain. So that's one thing. I really kind of keep myself to my research in the public domain, because I am looking at what's available to me from a digital perspective. So that is kind of part of what brought me to the PhD, was looking at, okay, well, what is out there now that archives are digitizing so much more information, what different kinds of questions can historians ask of information that they couldn't necessarily have access to before, right? I had my students look at a journal from the 1750s last year, handwritten journal that was later published into a book. But the difference between what he wrote in the journal and what was in the publication, mind-blowing. In his journal, he talks about, his raging drunken nights and all of the women he sleeps with. That does not show up in the publication at all. So they do help me sort of make a more well-rounded sort of approach.
Can I ask about the process? So you kind of start with, like this topic you're interested in and some manuscripts, right?
Let me talk about this
Yeah.
one, because this one is, as I said, it's peripheral to my research, actually. And this started because I wanted to give a paper at a conference on horses and humans. And so this had its origin in, well, what on earth do I do when I look at colonial Canada that has to do with horses and humans? And finding written materials is really difficult, but finding access to images was a little bit clearer. And And it gave me a way to sort of include a little bit of visual rhetoric into sort of my analysis. When I come from a sort of text-based historical methods home, this really sort of adds some depth and some richness to what I can actually do with my research and my students. So hopefully that is, yeah.
I have a question about the differences between the writing and the pictures, because the pictures to me are completely unrealistic.
Yeah.
I'm doing a project for Dr. Inescu right now, and it's kind of unrealistic. And so I look at this and I think, you're right. If anybody from England was thinking of coming to Canada, my God, why wouldn't you? Because it's so wonderful and everybody looks so nice and everybody gets along.
And they're having so much
and they're
friggin'
having
fun.
so much fun, and look at how beautiful the horses are, and
Yeah.
the women look wonderful. So how do you decide? I mean, if you don't have writing to go with the pictures, you would say that that's what it's like. So how do you decide what is the truth, the pictures or the writing?
Well, that's when you sort of get into your very basic primary source analysis that in any historian sort of will send you who's the author? So what's their background? When was this created? For what purpose? Who's the audience, right? All of those basic questions that I think we even ask of our images today. Who's creating it? For what purpose? Who's the audience? What's the background of the creator? How does this inform them? How do I unpack the bias? So all of that actually is what has to go in before I decide. And then I corroborate. So how many other images that do I have access to that are similar, right? And this is where looking at the Library and Archives database and having, okay, look, I've got this big swath of images that are in this same genre at this same time, showing almost the same thing. Obviously, they're not necessarily trustworthy on their own, but as a whole now, as an aggregate, there's a story to tell. Does that answer it?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, good. Yeah.
If there are no more questions, I just want to thank you, Trudy, for the truly fascinating talk. It was beautiful to look at, and just really, engaging. It gave us lots of things to think about.
Hopefully not too much.
So thanks again.
You're welcome.